Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on animal source foods in a changing world, regional livestock implications from EAT-Lancet 2.0. My name is Vanessa Maidu, and I'll be moderating our session today. I work for the Livestock Data for Decisions Network, which is supported by SEBI Livestock. We have an excellent program today featuring insights from this new EAT-Lancet report, and that will be followed by a rich discussion with leading experts in the field. Before we begin, a few housekeeping notes. The session will run for approximately 85 minutes. We will have a presentation followed by a roundtable discussion, and then we will open it up for your questions. You can post your questions anytime by pressing the Q&A button in Teams, and you can submit either questions or comments anytime throughout the session. My colleagues Gareth and Anna will be monitoring the questions and helping us select questions for the audience Q&A segment, which will happen later. If you see a question that you also wanted to post, you can upvote it. You can also comment on other people's questions. So we will try to answer as many as possible. Lastly, the session is being recorded, and we will share the recording via our YouTube channel afterwards. Now, let me introduce Dr. Karen Smith, Program Director for SEBI Livestock, for some opening words.
Thank you, Vanessa. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm delighted to welcome you to this discussion about the new EAT-Lancet report. It's wonderful to have such a breadth of participants join us from across the globe for this important discussion on the latest findings of the EAT-Lancet Commission and what they mean to the livestock systems worldwide. This webinar is hosted by Livestock Data for Decisions, the LD4D network, where we aim to strengthen evidence-based decision-making in the livestock sector. As such, today's webinar is framed as an exploration into the data and evidence behind the EAT-Lancet report, conclusions and recommendation. So we'll delve into those updated findings and discussion and discuss how the insights can inform decisions and decision makers at multiple levels, from global policy to national strategies and local implementation. We're really delighted to be joined by two of the report's co-authors, Professor Mario Herrero and Daniel Mason-Decross from Cornell University. They led the modelling work stream for the Commission. They'll share insights into the latest evidence and recommendation, and a big welcome to Mario, who is a long-term friend and colleague of LD4D and SEBI Livestock more generally. It's always great to have his input and insights. The presentation will be followed by an interactive discussion with members of the hardworking LD4D Steering Committee. And we have Shirley Tarawali, Assistant DG of the International Livestock Research Institute, Harvey, who's the Technical Director of Land O'Flex Venture 37, and Latifah Abdulkarim, Program Manager of Sahel Consulting. We will also leave time to address questions from you all in the audience Q&A segment at the end. So thank you all for being part of this conversation. I hope you enjoy the event and gain insights into this work. Without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Mario, who will get things started. Thanks, Mario. Over to you.
Thanks a lot, Karen. I will share my screen, and then we can actually proceed. Does everybody see this well? Hopefully.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, colleagues, it's a real pleasure to be here, giving you some insights into the second EAT-Lancet Commission report. This is a report that had been in the making for the last 3 years, and we just launched it last month in Stockholm. You probably remember that there was a first EAT-Lancet report that was launched in 2019. So this report presents some novel findings, and also we changed a lot of the things that had been criticisms in the first report. So I'm going to take you through a series of slides, and then we can actually have a round of questions. We always start with a slide like this, which is basically, you see all those curves ascending and really creating this great acceleration in the global food system. This is a common phenomenon, and you will probably have seen a range of other curves like this. This is from a series of scientists that observed these great acceleration curves, that they are basically the cause of many of the problems that we have with the world here. We have, total an increase in undernutrition and overnutrition, emissions, pesticide use. We are using the land and expanding on it. Everything's going up, and it cannot continue going up because we're going to run out of the world. That's a really, really big problem. Against this background, we also have a fundamental issue with how we're feeding the world. The moment we have 2 billion people lacking micronutrients, 150 million children stunted, 2 billion adults are overweight and obese. 41 million children are overweight. This is the first time that these statistics have been revised. This is the first time in the world that we have more people with obesity than we have undernourished. And my colleague Namukolo Kovic presented some of these results for Africa in a presentation that we did at ILRI. And one of her statistics really struck me. 45% of obesity in women in sub-Saharan Africa. 45%. So this is no longer, the overnutrition aspects are no longer only an issue of the rich countries. This is happening everywhere, and we're going to pay a bill for it because it's not for free. All this overnutrition ends up in non-communicable diseases that, perhaps the agricultural sector doesn't feel it. We feel the profits of ultra-processed foods and overconsumption, but the health sector is actually paying the bill. Let me give you an idea of the magnitude of the costs. In the US, the costs of diseases are $4.5 trillion, of which 80% are food associated. This gives you an idea of the magnitude of the bills that we are paying. Now, going back to the EAT-Lancet report, this time around, we focused on 5 chapters, one on healthy diets. So we reviewed all the evidence on the diet and health, including all forms of malnutrition. This was basically revisiting what was done in the first report. The food system boundaries were revised, others were included. We added a new chapter on justice in food systems, and I think that this chapter is actually fundamental. It's one of the gems of the report because it sets a framework to ensure that nobody's left behind in terms of the right to a healthy diet. The SOFA report had told us that about 3 billion people cannot afford a healthy diet, and therefore it's essential that we actually work on this component. The food system modeling, this is the piece that Daniel and I led, and this time around we departed from what was done in the first report, in the sense that we used 10 of the world's integrated assessment models to really deal with different aspects of food systems. One single model can't really catch up all the complexity that the food system has. Therefore, we had to use 10, and these are the models that are used in the IPCC, in IPBES, models that inform policy for the World Bank and a range of other institutions. Then we didn't leave it there. We also had a chapter on food systems transformation, exploring solutions barriers and action. So I'll take you briefly through a bit of this. Healthy diets. Well, here the definition of a healthy diet is really one of the crucial things that happens in this report. There is all sorts of regional variation. A healthy diet composed by food groups can be really different depending on where you are. For example, if you are in Latin America, you might be focusing on the rice and beans. But at the same time, rice can be exchanged for maize as your grain in Mexico, or millet in another place, and so on. So it is something that it's not a single diet for the whole world, and this is something really, really important. There's an enormous regional variation in the diets of the EAT-Lancet, but it's a diet that meets the nutritional requirements and the energy requirements, but also minimizes dietary risk factors. And this is a big focus of the EAT-Lancet diet, in the sense that many of the food-based dietary guidelines do not try to minimize as much the dietary risk factors that you observe like in the EAT-Lancet diet. So what are we trying? Which are the dietary risk factors? Too much salt, too little grains, too few vegetables, nuts, fish, perhaps some too high red and processed meats, sugars, and highly processed foods. One fundamental thing of the study is that there is no sustainability included in how we define the healthy diet. The healthy diet is just from the health perspective. Sustainability hasn't come up with. So the question is, if we feed everybody a healthy diet, can we produce it within planetary boundaries? Okay. So, but again, what are we talking about here? We're talking about, very simply, make the fruits and vegetables the star of the dish. That's what it is. And then consume enough whole grains. The EAT-Lancet diet allows for a range of animal source foods, and we want animal source foods in the EAT-Lancet diet. They are really, really important. They're nutrient rich. And the way we actually see it on a weekly basis is a glass of milk per day, plus another protein, with red meat only being consumed once. So one glass of milk, couple of times, poultry, eggs, fish, but one time. You can eat your steak, but eat one steak a week, and eat your glass of milk, drink your glass of milk. These are examples of types of menus from different cultures. So the EAT-Lancet diet is quite aligned with traditional diets in many ways that had these amounts of, that were really plant-rich, with relatively small amounts of animal source foods. So here just some delicious examples. Now, planetary boundaries. Where are we? Here, the key thing that we did on planetary boundaries is that we established what was the contribution of the food system to those boundaries. Obviously, there's many sources: the energy sector, materials, cities, etc. But from a the food system boundaries were not included. Here, what we find is that food systems dominate 5 of 6 of the transgressions. And you can see here, pesticides, novel entities, biosphere integrity, ecosystems function, biogeochemical flows, land use change, freshwater use. Those are really the most important. There's other boundaries, but in some we haven't really quantified enough what the food system contributes, and in other ones, simply the food system doesn't participate as much. But certainly, this is all resource use, and use, the use of products to, like fertilizers, etc., that will affect biogeochemical flows and others to produce the food that we need. Then justice. Justice, the fundamental framework, and I really encourage you to read this chapter, is basically trying to deal with three aspects of justice. We usually tend to focus on distributional justice. I mean, we're interested in not leaving the poor behind, etc. But in reality, we are interested also in recognitional justice. You know, it's really whose identities. It's really all about, you know, being able to recognize, for having people value what our cultural identities, our values are. That's really, really important. Representational justice, you know, it's essential, and it's one of the things that we've been battling for a long time. All of us that have worked in development, I think that see representational justice as something fundamental, because at the end of the day, whose voice are we really trying to represent in decision-making processes? And the affected need to be included in those decisions. And distributional justice, which is what we deal on a day-to-day basis, which is, you know, who eats, who doesn't eat, who eats most of the, you know, on ultra-processed foods, who gets the benefits, who are the losers, etc. We've dealt with that to a significant. So this basically at the end ends in a right-based approach of a right to decent work, right to food, right to a healthy environment. And then I'm going to show you some of the results and how we went about producing the EAT-Lancet quantification. So, as we said, we wanted to assess what were the consequences of dietary change. Here, if you use a justice framework, then everybody has to eat the diet. The question is not how many people could afford the diet or no. Everybody has to eat the diet, and that's a key consideration in the way we set up the modeling. So we dealt with this dietary change. Then we dealt with improved agricultural productivity, reduced food loss and waste. And then we checked an additional scenario on, well, what would happen if we could actually mitigate further greenhouse gases to try to be compatible with the 1.5 degrees Celsius. And the results included impacts on, you know, the environmental parameters, in this case, you know, greenhouse gases, water, nitrogen and phosphorus and others, the food production quantities, what would happen to labor? That was a question from the last one. If you contract a sector, well, what happens to the people that are employed? So we included that, and we included also producer prices and food expenditure. Can we actually make this diet more affordable? So what were the building blocks? And I want you to focus on the business as usual scenario, because that's where everything really, really starts. And it's basically how do we actually create a counterfactual, which is the business as usual scenario, versus our other scenarios on the EAT-Lancet components. So we start with conventional diets, and basically recent dietary trends associated with increased income. We know that GDP will actually change the diets, urbanization, etc. But this increase in income has led to increases in the consumption, particularly of animal source foods. We have increased productivity as another driver. You know, honestly, the agricultural sector has not been sitting quietly. There's been massive increases in productivity. So we owe it to farmers because, you know, the efficiency with which we produce food at the moment versus, you know, 50, 60 years ago is simply tremendous. But we used here, we analyzed all the trends on productivity to create this baseline. Then we use the middle of the road scenario for population and GDP. And we used in all the models the current policy environment, what's happening in climate and trade. Although, well, trade went down trade went to hell in the last few months, I would say, but we're not going to discuss that. And then, in contrast, what did we use for an EAT-Lancet food system? Well, we used that healthy diet that I mentioned. So that's a boundary condition defined to reduce the risk factors, the plant-based diet with moderate consumption of animal source foods. We did an increases in productivity beyond the baseline. The baseline going forward already contains a lot of technological change, but we actually used the shared socioeconomic pathway one, which is a more sustainability oriented with greater increases in productivity. This is very important because we ramped up that productivity impact, and then we have reduced food. We cut in half food loss and waste, and the climate mitigation scenario was based on what the 1.5 IPCC report did, which included emissions prices, new technology and land use policies to mitigate climate change. So you would see afforestation and a range of others. So what happens at the global level? At the global level, if you look at the business as usual scenario, what you see here in this bars in panel A is the actual sector. AGI is the whole of agriculture. LSP is livestock, ruminants, non-ruminants, dairy, crops, rice, wheat, and vegetable fruits and nuts and others. The reason why you see so many dots in red is because we're representing with the black hyphen, with the black mark here, that's the ensemble mean, okay? That's the ensemble, and what you see here in these dots are, the ensemble median, and what you see here in the dots are the results of all the different models. But what you can see here, if you go to, you see that agriculture might need to grow by about 37%. That's the median value, livestock by 33, and so on. So we live in a time of growth, okay? And there's differences in how much the different regions will actually have to grow, but all of them show very significant growth. You see there's sub-Saharan Africa, one of a region of great interest, having to experience increased growth very, very significantly. Basically 100% growth, doubling basically production of the agricultural production. So that's mainly due to the increases in population. So you see here significant changes in what different regions will have to do. Now, what happens when you implement at the global level, at the food systems transformation? You see here, for example, that, well, we're going to need to readjust what we actually produce to meet this planetary health diet. We still see aggregate growth, but at a slower rate. So agriculture under an EAT-Lancet grows by 8%. But it depends what we grow. We see, for example, fruits, vegetables, and nuts, oil seeds, and fish growing a lot. We see some of the animal products going down, but this is in a very, very aggregated way. We see in many parts the animal products increasing, especially in places that are under consuming. Remember that there's countries that are on a trajectory towards an EAT-Lancet diet and others where they have components of that EAT-Lancet diet that they are already over-consuming. So it's about trying to bring the world to this convergence for health and environment. But again, you see here regions like sub-Saharan Africa, again, not deviating from the baseline. Even under an EAT-Lancet diet, sub-Saharan Africa and most of the low and middle income regions really require very, very significant increases in what we require. Now, what happens to prices? Prices, in general terms, we get very, very modest prices in comparison. Meat prices would decline at the end of the run, and vegetables, fruits and nuts and legumes would actually increase. But this is all very relative. Meat prices will still be maintained, at least 10 times higher than most of the rest of the other components. So in reality, we don't see enormous meat price changes apart from, enormous food price changes apart from meat and the vegetables, fruits and nuts, that the demand will grow in really, really significantly. Now, the environmental results. This is a graph that we've tried to decompose. This is a graph that is in the report, but it's an important graph because it really shows if everybody ate the Planetary Health Diet, what would actually happen. So you see here the projected target in terms of land emissions, blue water use, nitrogen and phosphorus, and you see the current levels. So as you can see, land, well, we are already passing the amount by 4%, emissions by 33%, blue water, we are well in line in terms of where we are in terms of the current levels, but nitrogen and phosphorus, we are way over the planetary boundary. Now, we're going to project these and see actually what happens. So under an EAT-Lancet scenario, we end up really reducing environmental pressures across all dimensions. We end up, reducing land use by about 7% and emissions by 20%. Water, we also reduce, but nitrogen and phosphorus, we make inroads, but we're not there. And this is with the whole package of EAT-Lancet. Remember, EAT-Lancet is not about just changing the diet. It's also about increasing productivity and reducing food loss and waste. So when we do these three things that are really, big levers of change, we still don't make it on nitrogen and phosphorus use. Why? Well, because if we move to a plant-based diet, we will still need fertilizers. And yes, we will do well on the land for agriculture, but not on the nitrogen and phosphorus boundary. Now, when you look at the different drivers here, what does increased productivity do? Reduce food loss and waste or the diet shift? Yeah, in many cases you see, for example, let's start with the diet shift. The diet shift is probably the single most beneficial in at least for some of the dimensions, land use and greenhouse gas emissions. Also for water use, but nitrogen and phosphorus, it really doesn't change it. Reduce food loss and waste has some important, produces some important changes, but in reality, it's only when the three of them are implemented in a bundle that we get the synergistic effects. Why? Well, the diet, for example, creates a cap on the demand on consumption. So at least you have a target. You don't leave it on a bridge as would be if you just did an increase in productivity. Same, reduce food loss and waste is totally dependent on the quantities demanded. So it's roughly the same. So it's only when you put this cap and then you actually manage to produce more efficiently, that you really start creating inroads. Again, not dealing with nitrogen and phosphorus use. Now, I want to create a regional contrast because this is one of the most important parts of the report. We did everything by we didn't stick just to the global results, but of differences between regions and also data for many of the countries. So look at, for example, sub-Saharan Africa. Compare the business as usual on the right versus the EAT-Lancet results on the left. Basically, what we're dealing here with is a story of growth required due to population increases. But you can see the numbers are a little bit lower, but in reality, it's really a story where we really need to keep consuming a lot more. Apart from the boundary for ruminant meat, which is already well, it's really, it would need to be kept as is now for health considerations. But dairy, doubling of dairy, almost a doubling of non-ruminant meat and eggs, and very significant increases in fish. And then when you look at this, let's look at, for example, what happens with dairy here. And dairy for sub-Saharan Africa, we see the production, the producer prices, the area, and the greenhouse gas emissions in the top level, and for the baseline. And if you just apply if you apply the whole package of the EAT-Lancet, which is the last one, you will see that production will need to increase roughly the same. Producer prices will roughly be maintained, minus 5%. It's really not enough of a change. Area will increase roughly the same as under the baseline, and greenhouse gas emissions will be reduced from the baseline, which is, so there is an intensification process here on the EAT-Lancet because of the increases in productivity and the adoption of the diet. For the ruminant sector, for the meat sector, it's a little bit different. So you see here the baseline, you see the production at 94% with those producer prices and the greenhouse gas emissions increasing very significantly. And you see an EAT-Lancet scenario at the end. I'm not going to go through the individual factors, where you actually can see a growth of 1%, basically trying to maintain the current levels of production. Obviously, because there will be less demand, there will be a contraction in producer prices. But a really important effect on the meat side is the reduction in land areas and also the reduction in the greenhouse gas emissions. So the projected environmental impacts that you see here, one really important thing with sub-Saharan Africa is that if we implement all of this, we will not be really within planetary boundaries. The population increases, the growth of the different sectors and everything will not get us nor on the greenhouse gas emissions, nor, well, a little bit, you could maintain emissions if you implement the whole package. That's why you see that minus 1%, but it won't change emissions from very significantly from the business as usual. But look, blue water use, nitrogen use, and phosphorus will increase very significantly, and we will not be able to look at those percentages, over 200% for nitrogen and phosphorus. But that this is part of a justice argument. Even though we might want to analyze the planetary boundaries from from a global perspective, there's countries that will need to do greater efforts to achieve that healthy diet in terms of environment than others. And it seems to me that if Sub-Saharan Africa wants to eat the healthy diet, well, any increase in efficiency that we can obtain will actually reduce these environmental numbers. But as such, with what we have at the moment and the technologies and the productivity increases, we might not make it. I'm going to pass a few slides really quickly because we're running out of time.
Yeah, 2 minutes, please.
Yep. So, for Sub-Saharan Africa, the non-CO2 emissions, what you see here is from the baseline. We end up constructing this, I call them the Cadbury tablets, but you can see the impacts of the different measures, the increases in productivity. Well, increases in productivity by themselves will not really change total emissions. They will change emissions intensity, but that's not the point. It's really total emissions. But reducing food loss and waste, roughly the same. The diet shift starts getting us there. The whole package gets us to a quite significant reductions in emissions, about halving emissions. The mitigation scenario by itself, without implementing EAT-Lancet, really doesn't do too much because it requires the same kinds of measures. But EAT-Lancet plus mitigation, really get us down, but at incredibly high carbon prices. Carbon prices of over $500-600 in most of the runs, and this just it's totally against what we have at the moment. So the economics will matter tremendously when this gets implemented. And just to give you, an alternative contrast here. Well, what happens in Europe? Just compare it to Sub-Saharan Africa. So Europe, you have overconsumption of many of the products, and yes, you see, very modest growth in a business as usual. And these are the current projections that you have for all the sectors. But in an EAT-Lancet kind of world, with the levels of overconsumption of some of the components, you see, for example, ruminant meat minus 66%. Oops, sorry. Dairy. Well, there's very significant. Still, there is a need in Europe to consume more vegetables, fruits, and nuts. But the picture and what you need to do from a policy perspective is very different. So you have places like Sub-Saharan Africa, that you could perfectly align them, say, to a CAADP process. But you have, places like Europe where, the conversation needs to be really different if you want to meet the health metrics at the same time as the environmental ones. So you see here the different story of dairy for Europe and ruminants. So very different in comparison to Sub-Saharan Africa in terms of production under an EL2, under an EAT-Lancet 2, for example. It's a very significant decreases. Now, what to do about that is something that really we need to discuss. When we've talked to some of the OECD countries, there seems to be, there is this belief that they don't need to stop the production. The production can actually be exported to the countries that don't have. But obviously, that will have development ramifications if say, all this additional milk and meat gets sent to Sub-Saharan Africa. Well, that will create some development issues that merit some conversation. I'm quite happy to stop here, Vanessa, for allowing for questions, if that's okay with you.
That's really fantastic. Thank you so much, Mario, for that really comprehensive overview. I know a lot of people were keen to hear it straight from the source. Not everyone's had time to read the report, which is quite lengthy. So there's a lot to unpack there, but I think you've given a really comprehensive introduction. So we're really grateful for that. I just want to remind all participants to put questions in the Q&A. You could post your questions there, and we'll be keeping our eye on them. Did you want to say something?
No, that, we did this at ILRI with colleagues, but we used like 6 hours to explain everything. And then we really got into the weeds.
Absolutely. Well, with that, we will transition to our roundtable discussion. So I'd like to welcome our panelists. I invite them to turn their videos on. We've got Shirley, Di, and Latifah. So welcome all of you. And I'll say, why don't we start, and I'll ask, of course, Daniel as well to join us at the roundtable. Yes. So we'll start with a very quick round of introductions from Shirley, Di, and Latifah.
Thank you, Vanessa. I'm Shirley Tarawali from ILRI, where I focus on the strategy, management, board, and communication and advocacy.
Over to you, Latifah.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. Thank you, Mario, for the very detailed explanation. I'm Latifah Abdulkarim. I'm a development professional that focuses on designing and implementing programs that improve livelihood and production across the livestock value chain. Thank you.
Fantastic. And Di?
Great. Thank you very much, Vanessa, Mario, and everyone. Thank you for the great explanation. My name's Di Harvey. I'm the Global Technical Director for Land O'Lakes Venture 37, providing management and technical oversight for our interventions globally. Wonderful to be here. Thank you so much.
Fantastic. And all three of you are members of the LD4D Steering Committee, new members, I should say. And lastly, just making sure that we've got Daniel on the panel. Daniel, hello.
Hello.
Great. I'll add you here. So we're going to jump right in with the questions, and I'll do some light touch moderation to make sure that the discussion is flowing. So I'll just hand right over to Shirley for her first question.
Thanks very much, Vanessa. It's great to be part of this. As Mario said, we got into 6 hours of weeds, as it were, at ILRI, but I'm not going to take us there right now. One of the things for me is that I really appreciate the report's recognition of the importance of context. I might add diversity perhaps in there as well. But for me, that also raises some questions. And Mario, you just started to touch on that. In particular, one big question is where actually is all this food, not least milk, meat, and eggs, going to come from? Especially in those locations and for the segments of population who do not have access to enough animal source foods at the moment. How really could we be smarter about targeting the big system changes that are needed without compromising the multiple development roles that animals are currently playing for many of those very same populations?
Yeah, okay. Shirley, that's actually a great question. And I want to bring those two examples that I mentioned, the Sub-Saharan Africa and the European example. Where's all that production going to come from? Probably it will, the views on that will change depending also on where you are, because several of us will favor more inclusive development, where we can actually try to do this through in Sub-Saharan Africa, like what many of the donors are actually trying to do. But there is also a discussion around the world on this whole topic of relocation of production, where if you look at most of the big mitigation hot tickets, they do require that you produce in the most efficient places and then export to the regions that are less efficient. But of course, that might hamper all the development objectives in the sense of having agriculture being a source of livelihoods, and at the same time food. And with trade changing, with geopolitical conditions changing, a lot of people are also getting worried about food sovereignty. What happens if another Ukraine happens? What happens if all of a sudden trade patterns are cut? Are we going to put all our animal source food supply in the hands of some people that out of our control? So that's actually becoming a really important aspect. So I try to convince when I talk to to the big companies and everything, especially when you consider that there's relatively little penetration of the big private sector in many parts of sub-Saharan Africa in the commodities that we're interested in. It's really hard. They do want to send all the excellence to places, and that's been already happening. You look at the poultry in West Africa and so on, and for other products it's a little bit more difficult, but certainly here we see that at least for sub-Saharan Africa, sub-Saharan Africa could potentially have the resources at high yields and with appropriate input supply to actually meet the requirements for a healthy diet, and not be under planetary boundaries, but at least certainly produce a healthy diet.
That's great. I'd like to invite Di to ask a question, or maybe Daniel has a follow-up on what Mario has said.
No, I think Mario summed up a pretty good response there. So let another question come up.
Great, thank you very much. I'm sort of interested in the quid pro quo, if you like, within the global, looking at the global effects that are happening. So within the report's modeling, how did the productivity increases needed in low-income regions quantitatively compare to the waste reductions and the changes that needed to happen in the high-income regions? Specifically, what I'm sort of asking about was, does the report provide specific matrix on how much dietary transformation in the high-income regions would allow and free up resources and environmental space, if you like, or the damage to our planet, for agricultural intensification in the current food insecure regions?
Daniel, do you want to take that one?
Thanks for an easy one, Mario. Quantitatively, I'm not sure how to answer that question, because fundamentally what we see with food loss and waste is that across regions, what we really have are pretty similar levels of food loss and waste. It's just that where in the value chain they happen is different. So in high income countries, it's much more towards the end of the value chain on the consumer side, and in low and middle income countries, we see a lot more is on the food loss versus the food waste side. And so a lot of these models are pretty coarse, and so they can't really capture all of the detail across the value chain super well. And so when we have a reducing of food loss and waste, it varies by food group. So some food groups are more perishable than others, and that's captured in the models. But that kind of differentiation in terms of sort of high and low income regions with the food loss waste, because that kind of the total amount of waste is, that share is similar, it's kind of difficult to pull that out. What I can say is that we see with productivity, In general, these models assume a certain amount of sort of catching up that's possible within low and middle income countries. This idea that increasing productivity in low and middle income countries, there's more potential because there's the possibility of applying cutting edge technologies and practices that haven't yet been applied. Whereas in high income countries where you're already kind of at that production frontier, there's less opportunity. It really is about sort of creating new and novel approaches. And so what we do see on that is that there tends to be an increase, a faster increase in productivity in sort of low and middle income countries compared to high income on average. And what we also see is that the role that these drivers play varies dramatically by region. So they're really, really important, both of them, for mitigating price increases. So in low and middle income countries, we see a shift to a healthy diet could actually increase food expenditure, whereas in high income countries, because we consume too much of everything, a shift to healthy diet can actually make our diets cheaper. And that's true today. And would be true into the future. But in low and middle income countries, the shift can often increase food expenditure. And so productivity and food loss waste reduction are really important in terms of helping mitigate some of those price increases. And so one of the questions I think there that Gareth maybe had was like, which are the most important interventions? Well, it kind of depends by region, but what we see is that you kind of need a bundle of these to make sure that you kind of offset some of the unintended trade-offs on some of these types of shifts. So didn't fully answer that, but hopefully give a few nuggets to give some food for thought.
Thanks a lot, Daniel. Does anyone on the panel want to add to that or build on that? Otherwise, we can turn to the next question. Yeah, go ahead, please.
I had a build on that, and that's the question about Mario touched right at the beginning on the fact that we see obese people increasing across everywhere. So this question about how much does it cost when you change your diet, reduce or increase, I don't know that we're talking about region, even in gross terms. It's more about perhaps segments of the population, the richer, wealthier parts and the less wealthy parts, or something, isn't it? Are we?
In the ideal world, yes, but we really don't. We need to find different kinds of tools for doing those kinds of analysis. It's really, really hard, especially we would need to do a country level and yes, population level kind of analysis to pick on that one. I don't think that with the current tools we are well equipped for that.
Thanks very much.
But it's essential, it's essential, as what Namkolo mentioned, 45% of obesity in women, and it's increased from 33 to 45 in the space of since 2010, so it's 15 years. So it's here. It's here. We need to deal with that.
Thanks, Mario. And I believe Latifah had a question relating to that. Over to you, Latifah.
I was just going to build on that. Thank you, Vanessa. I think just riding on something Mario mentioned about how we can produce diets within planetary, boundaries, and this discussion about food losses, dietary shifts, and different drivers that affect, the diets across the world. I'll just see if you can touch on what innovations you think smallholder livestock value chains, what innovations in smallholder livestock value chains could be meaningful in cutting food losses, especially when we talk about spoilage, inefficiencies, and all that, without necessarily imposing high costs on women and low-income farmers. And this is mainly talking about it from the perspective of how we can have maybe inclusive and, would I say, gender-responsive programs that can help households shift their consumption habits away from having excesses more towards nutrient adequacy, while also reducing overall household level food wastage.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the question, Latifah. I've seen some great examples. For example, in East Africa, in Kenya, there's a lot of work that GAIN has been doing on reduction of food loss and waste, both in the vegetable and in the animal source food informal markets. They have a series of female vendors that are equipped with first of all, they sell really fresh produce sourced from they've created markets, slightly bigger markets, so they can consolidate and have a lot more food safety, and they get the produce from those consolidated markets and then sell them in the slums with the guarantee that the food is actually has been actually processed in more under healthier conditions. And this has actually happened both for poultry, for milk in general terms. And they've actually asked street kids, they've given them motorcycles so they can deliver these products from these consolidated markets into the slums, and that has decreased travel times. That has actually helped a lot. Then on a more technical basis, there's a lot of people trying new packaging and new ways of drying and trying to do more the high-tech kind of technology to increase sell by dates and things like that. So that is something that's happening. I even believe that ILRI have been involved in some of those in the past.
That's great. I'm going to allocate a little bit of extra time because it's really getting interesting. So let's take another maybe 6-7 minutes for this panel discussion before we open up to audience questions. And I'll just say, I've noticed that Daniel has very dutifully been responding to your questions in real time. So thank you so much, Daniel. So keep your eye on the Q&A, and if you have a question, do post it there. Back to the panel. We'll go back to Shirley. I think you had a second question.
Yeah, I'm again recognizing that the Planetary Health Diet does give opportunities for that flexibility. Mario illustrated that very well in terms of context and diversity within those boundaries. I'm wondering about the level of granularity there, though. You had it by, quite big region kind of thing, thinking about by country, by region, by system, maybe even by individual. We just touched on who has more money and less money. What level of granularity can we, or must we, perhaps the question is, get to in order to really make this work, let me say?
Who wants to take that?
Daniel?
Well, so I think it's worth noting that in terms of the diet and things like that, quite a bit of work was done to sort of look at different types of consumers, with recognizing that women and men have different energy requirements and different nutritional requirements. Adolescents, adults, and elderly have different age requirements. But I think these are still sort of like representative human beings, and so in terms of granularity with these, there would often have to be some sort of recognition that individual sort of constraints would have to be taken into account. But I think they're useful guides as are food-based dietary guidelines in terms of giving us sort of general benchmarks within which to work with. The modeling that we did was inherently somewhat on the coarser side, so there are tools that can give us some insights that's regional, and even some of the models that participated can provide some country level results. but the scenarios we ran were ultimately global. And so I think what we should be looking at is this is a useful sort of kind of gives us a sense of whether or not the end objective is worth pursuing, like is trying to achieve something like this give us enough bang for our buck that it's worth trying to think about how to achieve it. And then the next steps really are about developing those really context-specific pathways of change so that we can start trying to do these transformations, recognizing that those trade-offs and synergies will be very different in different locations, given very different starting points. And so I think that's one of the things here moving forward. I think the first two EAT-Lancet reports have been helpful in giving us a sense that, yeah, these big changes would have substantial benefits. So it's worth exploring how we can start to move in that direction. But now we really need the detailed parts of how we do it is almost as important as whether or not the endpoint is worth doing.
Yeah, and Shirley, I would love to say another thing that, you know, it's, if you think about the whole package, it is daunting. So we need to really start little by little. There's certainly low-hanging fruits. For example, there's countries that have made very significant inroads on, say, productivity increases. Well, then you start there. You already have the infrastructure. You already know how to do that. Well, you start there. The key for me, and probably the most difficult of them all, is the one on healthy diets. You know, productivity and food loss and waste, they're largely technical and market fixes. And there's, you know, we can tweak, we can add gadgets, interventions, etc. But dietary change is mostly behavioral. And that's the hard nut to crack. For me, it's great to see that on a trajectory towards an EAT-Lancet kind of diet, at least for some populations. But you know, how to actually reduce the rates of, say, of obesity, or once you've reached a healthy diet, how not to overshoot it and continue in the same way as the Western countries did. That is the tricky thing. And I think that we need to start now in ensuring that, you know, we set the guardrails for that not to happen, because at the end of the day, and yes, and Beth, absolutely, I completely agree with you that it's the food environment is absolutely one of the key things, especially when you look at all the ultra-processed food that's, you know, it's very shelf stable and everything, all sorts of noodles and sweet stuff. I would totally agree with you on that one. But yes, that is the tricky one to adjust. I think that the other ones will certainly come, and we see a lot of things already happen.
Thanks, Mario, and thanks for keeping your eye on the chat and responding to Beth. That's great. Latifah, over to you. I think we have time for one more question from you and potentially one from Di before we open to the audience.
All right, thank you. I think just building on the discussion in the room and what everyone is saying about, you know, healthy diets and how some regions do not even have access to this diet. I'd like to ask Mario or Daniel, how do you think livestock-based market systems in low and middle income countries can support these communities facing underconsumption of, you know, healthy diets, and in the process avoiding overproduction and overconsumption cycles, training planetary boundaries like have been discussed in the EAT-Lancet?
Do you want to tackle that one, Daniel?
Yeah, I mean, I think so much of that is going to end up being questions around sort of how do we create more sort of equitable and fair societies in terms of sort of sharing the burden. And I think one of the nice things about the justice section is that it does kind of give us a language, at least to start thinking about how to discuss these, both in terms of sort of thinking of a right to food, but I think almost as important as this idea of rights is also this idea of sort of obligations, which I think is one of the things that we'll have to recognize that it's not just about what things we can do, but also what things we sort of what are our shared responsibilities to society and to our fellow citizens. And so I think that that's one part. There's definitely going to be challenges in terms of distribution, and I think this is one of the pieces that moving forward we need to do a lot more work focusing on the value chain. And there's real trade-offs here, right? Because Mario's already mentioned this challenges with ultra-processed foods, but we do need to find ways that we can create that value addition, which is fundamental from a livelihoods perspective, that so many people currently are making a livelihood from that sort of the value addition that comes through the processing. And we need to find ways that how do we support those people so that we can start increasing sort of production of healthy foods along the value chain, that this can be a way of livelihood creation, and also that then is a fundamental part of sort of achieving sort of helping with those who are under consuming, because ultimately underconsumption is really a question about poverty and access. And so if we can find ways of raising the floor, then that can really help. And then I guess the challenge of preventing or reducing overconsumption is really a political one, right? Where it's one where we have to find ways of how do we agree that enough is enough, and where is that boundary, and that's very challenging. It's not so much a technical problem, whereas I think the underconsumption and some of these other pieces, that's where technology and other pieces can really play a major role, and we definitely need to keep investing and sort of focusing on those. And then I guess we have to we can't pass the buck on making sure that we're active as citizens to try to sort of encourage the political changes that we might need to sort of help with the overconsumption side. I don't know,
Yeah,
Mario, if
and
you have anything to add.
I would just add that, we haven't talked about the private industry, and the private industry will have, the public-private conversation really needs to come to the fore in a much more, in a much more evident way. And, I know that the private industry hates when you talk about regulation, but there needs to be some regulation. It's not only incentives for them to change, their product portfolios that will take us a long way. We will really need some regulations in some of the foods that we already know are the culprits of of obesity epidemics and things like that. So I really think that this is definitely the big topic to tackle.
Great. I think that we are starting to get a huge flurry of audience questions now. People's interest has been sparked. So if it's okay, Di, we're going to skip your last question and dive right in to some of these questions from the audience. So Gareth and Anna have been very carefully monitoring the Q&A. So I'm going to invite Gareth to pick a question for the panel.
Thanks, Vanessa. Daniel has done a really good job of answering a lot of them, but I'll pick up on a few of them that it'd be good to maybe hear more about. There's one from Brian Perry talking about how the model results, asking how the model results translate into national level advice for countries to balance national sustainability and efficiencies in their policies.
Do we want to ask Mario to jump in on that?
Yeah, well, at national level, the results are already being used. We have the global models, but at the same time, we have a lot of the national results, and we can actually downscale some of these to the country level. Many countries have actually used different parts of this to first look at, for example, what priority commodities they need to invest more on. And certainly, for example, the fact that in many places we don't have enough fruits, vegetables, and nuts is one of the key things that needs to be promoted or funded even more. That's one of the things. Then the diets have already been used a lot for developing school meal programs. For example, in many countries, Brazil's already implementing school meal programs based on the diets. There's many cities that have actually taken the recommendations as well. and done this. I think that on the productivity side, I think that we are in the majority of the parts on track, of places on track, but I think that the investment through the CG and through national systems on increased productivity, I think that that's been, the more standard narrative. But I do think that many countries are already trying to implement, say, link this to environmental objectives as well. So it's not productivity just per se, but productivity within environmental bounds. That's happening around the world already. But certainly, where we're interested in is in taking national results and presenting them and sit with decision makers. I think that this is the key, and we need to try to facilitate those talks. This kind of events are good for bringing people, opening the discussion, but in reality, things need to happen at the country level. We need to go and talk in Kenya and talking to different parts, engaging the CADEP process. It's all about this essential engagement now that needs to happen. The translation of the results takes time, as we know with Brian, and it needs to be sustained, and it needs to be something more continuous than just the preparation of a report or a webinar.
Thanks, Mario. That's a great point. Just checking if anyone in the panel wants to add to that or build on that.
Not to the webinar, but it's really it's this constant engagement, being there at the time when people really need numbers and discussion, and that is what really needs to happen.
Thanks so much. We have time for another question, either from the audience, if Gareth or Anna have one. They've actually, Daniel, you've answered most of them, which is fantastic. So we may not have to rehash them. Otherwise, we can turn to Dai, because I know he had an unanswered question still from before. Anna, I think, yeah, you've identified one, so I'll just turn over to you, Anna, to ask the next question.
Yes, so we have one question from, well, we have several, but let's see how much the panel can answer. So one is, how much greenhouse gas emissions are projected to come from ruminant meat production? Would shifting from ruminant meat to plant-based diets make a significant difference? How do you view this from the perspective of future dietary trends? Thank you. So it's a lot of questions.
So, I mean, maybe I can start, because I did a little bit of a response there, but essentially, from agriculture sector, the majority of emissions come from two primary sources, which is either livestock, ruminant meat, or dairy production, or indirectly through land use change from sort of expansion of agriculture, often in part to produce feed and other resources. And so a shift towards a plant-based diet, I'm assuming this means sort of a complete shift to sort of like a vegan or a vegetarian diet, would certainly reduce emissions. But I think it's one of the things that we don't fully capture is sort of the recognition that the first 10% reduction in consumption and production of livestock products would almost certainly have a bigger emissions reductions than the last 10% of reduction in livestock consumption. And so if we were comparing sort of a shift to a completely vegetarian or vegan diet compared to the sort of EAT-Lancet flexitarian diet, there would be potentially some additional emission reductions from that. But whether or not that we fully capture all of the other potential positive benefits of animal source food production in sort of other environmental contributions within sort of circular feed systems, within sort of more managed grazing, is a little bit difficult to say. And I would say that the vast majority of the emissions benefits that we would get we could see from kind of reducing the sort of healthy recommendations, and any further reductions that might happen afterwards. There would be some, but perhaps the trade-offs on those might not be, they're not entirely clear. We would need to explore whether or not that you would get sort of the full gains on those emissions if you went all the way vegetarian. If we're talking about moving towards sort of some of the meat and dairy analogs in terms of sort of these like the Meat Beyond Burger and things like that, in general, that they do tend to have reductions on emissions compared to beef. Their current technologies in terms of their emission intensities are somewhat similar to, say, pork or poultry. Of course, they're still in the early stages of those technologies. So if they were to be adopted and scaled up, then their emissions intensities could fall. And if we were to decarbonize our electrical grid, then they could fall even further. And there is some work, not so much in EAT-Lancet, but in other areas that have started to explore the potential contributions of these sort of novel alternative proteins. And I think that there is certainly promise, and this might be a way of helping to sort of shift towards more plant-based diets, even though there's trade-offs within ultra-processed food. So as in all things, lots of complexity, and it will depend a little bit on, in many cases, we'll be picking the second best solutions, not necessarily the optimal ones, and we'll have to decide on trade-offs in those contexts.
Thanks, Daniel. And I'm actually very curious if Shirley, Latifah, or Dai have any thoughts on that. You're working in countries with livestock keepers. You're looking at issues around human nutrition. How does that resonate with you?
I mean, to me, it's relating this opportunity to the system on the ground, because in many cases, what we already have is a plant-based diet. it's beans and whatever in the mix, and the question becomes, how can we transition that production system to something that produces the right mixture, if you like, to meet the EAT-Lancet recommendations within the boundaries, so that we're not switching to impossible burgers, but we've got lots of ingredients already in the system mix, as it were, that could contribute to getting this, what do we call it, more rounded, balanced diet, sometimes a bit more animal food or whatever it might be. So I think we need to do more to connect these different levels of, nutrients and diets and the systems that produce the foods and how they get then combined together.
Thanks, Shirley. And I'm seeing a lot of nodding. Dai, did you want to add anything? No. Latifah?
No,
Okay.
I agree with Shirley. Yeah. She really does contextualize it, especially from the sub-Saharan African context. Yeah.
That's really fantastic. And really thank you everyone who submitted your very thoughtful questions. I see that they're still being answered in real time. We have a few minutes to go in the webinar, so you might still get some late answers from Daniel and Mario. We're heading towards the closing. I do want to give each of our speakers and panelists an opportunity to share any further final thoughts or key takeaways. So we'll start with Mario and Daniel, about a minute each, just sort of where do you see things going? What's happening next? I know, Mario, you and Daniel, you're on a big engagement journey now, doing a lot of outreach and speaking with stakeholders about the results and findings. So let us know what's next for you and any takeaways from today.
Yeah. Okay. So, well, we've been doing these kind of discussions. We felt that these are great for sensitizing people on the contents of the report. But in reality, the most rich discussions have come from longer discussions with stakeholders, and that's something that we would really like to engage in more. It's really incredible how much we can actually achieve by having the depth of discussion. And for this, one thing that we've been doing is we've developed these communities of practice. So we have now 15 communities of practice, ranging from farmers, from restaurateurs, from health practitioners, from private industry, and we've been working with them for now more than 8 months. And the plan going forward is to create them, create more of these, because it's really about the dialogue. It's not really tweaking or trying to produce new results or everything like that. It's taking the richness of what has been produced and really downscale it, and then identify who would need to do that. What are the actions that are really more feasible than others? I think that Bruno was mentioning something on feasibility, but yeah, what needs to happen? How is the roadmap to really engage in this discussion to achieve things across sectors, from the health to the production to environment, and who would need to do what? This will not work unless there is some level of accountability. So it's essential that we're actually working with the right actors for this to happen.
Thanks,
But
Mario.
please, and what I would say to this community, please engage. It's not good enough to be passive. We need to actually all contribute to the discussion, and it's welcome. And even if it's bruising and abrupt or whatever, we need to actually all engage. It's important.
Great. Daniel, 2 minutes.
Yeah. Well, I would second everything Mario just said, but I also say I think one of the key things that we've been, and not just from EAT-Lancet, but other work we've been doing with EAT-Best and other exercises here, is just how important it is that we need to get out of this sort of mindset of single interventions and into kind of more of a nexus and a bundled approach, and just recognizing that the complexity of the challenges that we're looking at is going to require multiple trade-offs. There's going to be all sorts of issues. These are going to be very context specific. And so we really need to be engaging with more local context in terms of how to make these changes, in terms of what are the first steps, which will be very different from one region to another. And that's where I think, again, just seconding what Mario is saying, this is where engaging with people in different sectors, in different regions, will just be fundamental if we want to start moving towards more sustainable food systems, and trying to find out then, within those contexts, within those different regional priorities, how do we start making motions, and then thinking about maybe some of the goals of EAT-Lancet aren't the first priorities within certain regions, but then we can start thinking about, well, how do we achieve those without then also preventing us from making progress towards other objectives? And so maybe we have some first steps we need to do, but how do we make sure that the paths we choose then don't replicate the same mistakes that we've already made in high income countries, where can we find ways to sort of avoid some of the development pathways that we're now having to sort of dig ourselves out of, and then in general, just again, with getting to do more engagements, seeing more perspectives, and trying to find new ways to sort of move towards more sustainable pathways for food systems. So yeah, reach out to us if you have any questions. We're happy to engage.
Thanks so much, Daniel. All right, over to our panel for some closing thoughts. I'm going to mix it up. We'll start with you, Latifah, if that's all right.
Thank you, Vanessa. Thank you, Mario and Daniel. I think the most striking point for me is something Daniel has quite emphasized on. So I'll just reiterate in my own thoughts. The fact that, we have, I admire the fact that the edition really brought to light the differences that exist, across different regions, the different situations that different populations also face when it comes to their diet, when it comes to adopting healthy diets, transitioning into adopting these diets and nutritional issues, and how it can be very specific. So I think for me, my takeaway would be the fact that while we design solutions for these different populations, we need to contextualize it more locally. We need to look at it from the region we are trying to solve their problem, and try to see what is the most striking issue in that region and bring it to life first. So it doesn't mean we have to design a one solution fits all approach. It wouldn't work. We need to try to make it more diverse. This may cost more money, this may cost more resources, but this is likely or seemingly the only approach to go if we want to make sustainable and lasting solutions to these problems. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Latifah. Let's hear from you, Dai. Takeaway thoughts.
Great, thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. Firstly, thank you so much to Daniel and Mario for giving us such a wonderful presentation. I think my takeaways is I really enjoy the looking at this at food systems, at a food systems level. Often we look at it through our own particular pillar. So, you know, as agriculturalists, we'll be looking at it from productivity perspectives, from, you know, industry side, we're looking at food loss and waste. And then from the health people, looking at it from sort of dietary change and change from that side. So looking at this at a food systems way, I think is a great way. And this gives us a framework. And I would concur with everything that everyone has said. This is the beginning. And it is really, really important that we break down the barriers, and we're not just always singing to ourselves as agriculturalists and people involved in the food systems,
Exactly.
but we're rather ensuring that we're engaging with our colleagues from health, our colleagues from policy, our colleagues from all of these other areas, so that we're actually beginning to get that message out. Because, you know, the first thing that we all love to do is to say no. And so we've got to take it switch it a little bit, put it in a positive. We have the frameworks. Let's have a look at this. How do we localize it? Following up on Latifah's great word, how do we localize it, contextualize it? And now we've got a bit of a framework. We've got to get this conversation, and really, let's go. Thank you so much.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dai. All right, Shirley, I'll give you 1 minute before we close. Over to you.
Thank you, and thanks everyone for great discussions. Mario, Daniel, great to engage again. My takeaways are this is both fantastic and daunting. It's fantastic because we actually have this starting point that allows us to build on in different contexts and situations, and to think about those different starting points and the different trajectories that can be supported. It's daunting. It's daunting because of what Dai just said. We've got to get so many people around the table who perhaps don't usually sit around the table. But it's also daunting for me because of the urgency, and how we grapple with that is really quite a challenge. But this is a great start. Thank you very much.
Excellent. So thank you so much for all of those excellent closing thoughts. To our audience, thank you so much for joining us today and for your excellent questions and engagement. And thank you once again to Mario, Daniel, Shirley, Dai, and Latifah for sharing their expertise, and also to the LD4D team for their support throughout this session.